Hello everyone, and welcome to the newest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I am your host Robin Warder, and at long last we are going to deliver part 2 of a story we started 2 weeks ago. The controversial conviction of Tommy Zeigler, who has spent the last 40 years on death row for 4 murders. Like I said last week, this case is so convoluted that I just had to turn it into a 2-part episode, but now I have finally returned to provide you with the conclusion. I apologize for leaving you folks hanging in suspense for so long, as we were originally supposed to release this episode last week, but trust me, there's a very, very good reason for the delay. After the release of Part 1, I got in touch with private investigator Lynn Marie Carty, who has worked with Tommy Zeigler's defense team for the past 5.5 years, and I should mention, she has done all her work on the case pro bono. The primary source for most of the material I presented in Part 1 was Fatal Flaw, an amazingly comprehensive book about the case written by Philip Finch. However, that book was published way back in 1992, and a lot of new developments have occurred since then. Investigator Carty has uncovered a plethora of new information within the last few years, which is available for viewing at her website, TommyZeigler'sInnocent.com. It is the original source of most of the material on this episode, and Investigator Carty has been extraordinarily helpful with supplying me with info and helping me correct some errors in my original rough cut. This is what necessitated the week-long delay, as we wanted to ensure that the information presented here was as accurate as possible and that all the key points were covered. I am very grateful for her assistance, and it's clear that she will not give up until Tommy Zeigler is a free man again. But before we get started, I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank 2 of my listeners, Alice and Amber, who have recently made donations to The Trail Went Cold. In fact, they have both signed up to make regular monthly donations, and we are very flattered by that. So, thank you very much, Alice and Amber. Just a quick reminder, The Trail Went Cold now has its own PayPal account and a new donate button on the website. If you feel like making a one-time only donation or signing up for monthly donations, we would be incredibly grateful and will be sure to give any of our generous donors a shout-out on a future episode. Anyway, if you haven't listened to Part 1 of this story yet, I highly recommend you do so right now. But even if you have listened to it, maybe do so again just in case you need a refresher. I left you folks on such a massive cliffhanger last week, so I don't want to bore everyone by repeating every single detail of this case, but here's a quick synopsis of the most important stuff. In 1975, Tommy Zeigler lived in Winter Garden, Florida with his wife Eunice. On Christmas Eve, 4 people were murdered inside Tommy's family business, the W.T. Zeigler Furniture Store. Eunice Zeigler, her parents Perry and Virginia Edwards, and a customer named Charlie Mays, who was allegedly there to pick up a television set after closing. Tommy claimed he entered the store and was attacked in the darkness by unknown intruders. He believed that Charlie Mays was one of the intruders, and that he shot him while firing off one of his guns in self-defense. Tommy also received a gunshot wound to the abdomen, but police believed the wound was self-inflicted and that he committed all 4 murders himself. His motive was to collect on a $500,000 life insurance policy from Eunice's death, and he supposedly killed her parents as well because she was planning to divorce Tommy and return home to Georgia with her parents because he was a closet homosexual. Tommy then killed Charlie Mays in an attempt to frame him for the crime. The 2 main witnesses against Tommy at his trial were Edward Williams, a part-time delivery man for the furniture store, and Felton Thomas, who claimed he accompanied Mays to the store that night. The prosecution alleged that Tommy was also planning to murder Williams and Thomas inside the store to frame them for his crime, but they both managed to escape and testify against him. The jury found Tommy guilty of all 4 murders, but even though they recommended life imprisonment, Judge Maurice Paul decided to overrule them and sentence Tommy to death. And that is where we left off. At long last, let us now return to the Tommy Zeigler case. So Tommy is sent to death row, but as attorneys figure they will be able to overturn the death sentence, given that Judge Paul made a rather questionable decision to overstep his boundaries. But that doesn't quite happen. In fact, there were 2 separate occasions when Tommy was dangerously close to his execution date, before he was granted a stay. On May 20th, 1986, Tommy was literally hours away from being executed, but one of his original attorneys, Vernon Davids, made a pretty remarkable gesture when he filed a motion for a stay on the grounds that his own representation at Tommy's trial had been incompetent. So in essence, Davids was willingly doing damage to his own professional reputation in order to save Tommy's life. But it worked, as Tommy was granted his stay, and he has never come that close to being executed ever since. Meanwhile, Tommy's defense team would uncover a lot of interesting new evidence over the years, which they hoped would garner him a new trial. Remember that slug which was found in the orange grove? Even though it was never matched to any of the murder weapons, a member of the prison work crew who found the slug sent a letter to Vernon Davids, claiming that the crew had searched there for 2 days without finding anything, until he overheard a sheriff's deputy say, "We will just have to produce one anyway." After that, the inmates were told to say they found a slug, even though they never did. In 1979, the defense were contacted by a couple named Ken and Linda Roach. They claimed that on the night of the murders, they were driving by the furniture store at approximately 7:20 when they heard a series of about 10 loud pops, which sounded like gunfire. They also claimed they saw 4 separate vehicles parked in front of the store. Theoretically, if the state's version of events were true, there should have only been 2 vehicles parked outside at this time: Curtis Dunaway's Oldsmobile and Perry and Virginia Edwards' sedan. Interestingly, the Roaches specifically stated they saw a light-colored Cadillac there. In his original statement, Felton Thomas had claimed that Zeigler picked him up in a light-colored Cadillac, even though he was driving Curtis Dunaway's Oldsmobile that night. The Roaches also thought they saw a dark-skinned man walking outside the store, who seemed to match the description of Charlie Mays, even though Mays, nor any other dark-skinned people, should have been near the store until 7:30. It wasn't until after Zeigler was indicted that the Roaches realized they had passed by the same store where the murders took place. They tried contacting the police, but were completely blown off, and they never got in touch with Zeigler's attorneys until years after the trial. It's also worth noting that other witnesses in the area besides the Roaches reported hearing those loud pops which sounded like firecrackers that night. They all described hearing those pops occur in very quick succession, and if they actually were gunshots, it's unlikely that one person could have fired that many successive shots so quickly. In 1987, the defense received some pieces of evidence which had not been turned over to them by the prosecution during the trial. One of them was a report written by the first policeman who arrived at the scene, who claimed that Zeigler's blood was already dry when he found him. The most interesting piece of evidence was a tape-recorded interview between the prosecution's chief investigator and a young man named John Jellison, who was staying at the Winter Garden Inn, the motel behind the furniture store, on Christmas Eve. He claimed that sometime between 8:15 and 8:30, he looked outside and saw a police car parked behind the store, and a policeman was hiding behind it, holding up a gun. Jellison also claimed he heard what sounded like gunshots at around 9 o'clock. Zeigler did not phone Chief Fickey until 9:18, so what was an armed police officer doing behind the furniture store nearly an hour before the police were called in? The defense had deposed every single police officer in Winter Garden to account for their whereabouts that night, but none of them ever mentioned being parked behind the furniture store during that time period. Zeigler always shared his suspicions that some of the local police had it in for him because of his testimony at Andrew James's trial and because of his attempts to expose the loan sharking racket. So did the presence of this mysterious police officer suggest this whole thing was an elaborate setup orchestrated by the cops and that Zeigler was framed? Well, there might actually be another explanation for the sighting of this officer, which we'll get to in a moment. But one of the most troubling unanswered questions which gnawed away at the defense team was a strange inconsistency in the paperwork. The original arrest report, which was used to arrest Zeigler while he was in his hospital bed, it listed someone named Robert Foster as a witness. In fact, this report listed Foster as doing the things Felton Thomas did, such as pulling the store's electrical switch to turn off the power, running away in fear when Zeigler invited Charlie Mays into the store, and turning himself into the police. Foster's name was also mentioned in some handwritten investigators' notes, and he was actually listed as a witness instead of Felton Thomas in a couple of articles about the case which were published in the Orlando Sentinel-Star. The first article, published on New Year's Eve, had the headline, "Witness at Killings Begs for Jail," and it mentioned how Charlie Mays entered the store and saw a woman's body, and then yelled at Foster to get out of here. For the next 3 weeks, more articles would be published listing Foster as a witness who was in protective custody with the police. Yet when the preliminary hearing rolled around, Felton Thomas stepped in to testify, and this was the last anyone heard of this Robert Foster guy. When the lead investigator, Don Fry, was questioned about this, he claimed that the mention of Robert Foster in the report was nothing more than a typographical error, and that they'd meant to type Felton Thomas all along. Robert Foster, he did not actually exist. However, a woman named Mary Wallace, who happened to be Edward Williams's landlady, she was certain Foster was real. He was apparently a large black man who was acquainted with both Edward Williams and Charlie Mays. Mays played on a softball team run by Wallace's husband, and she said Foster umpired some of their games. And there was also an interesting eyewitness account from Ed Nolan, the elderly man from the Kentucky Fried Chicken, who hung around the murder scene after the police arrived that night. According to Nolan, when Charlie Mays' wife showed up and was informed about her husband's murder, she was in the company of a large black man, and Nolan believed he heard Mrs. Mays refer to him as Robert. You're probably already thinking that the police's explanation about Robert Foster being a simple typo sounds pretty absurd, but wait until you get a load of this. A large black man matching Foster's description had attempted an armed robbery at a Gulf gas station across the street from Zeigler Furniture Store on Christmas Eve, the very same night of the murders. It would be decades until investigator Lynn Marie Carty definitively proved that this Robert Foster existed, and it's a pretty remarkable story. She interviewed Susie Ambler Graydon, who was working with her mother at the gas station on Christmas Eve when the attempted robbery took place. In fact, Susie's mother actually grabbed the robber's gun through the customer window, which is what prompted him to run away. Anyway, Susie remembered that the suspect looked a lot like the actor from The Green Mile, who of course was the late great Michael Clark Duncan. So Inspector Carty taped a photograph of the actor to her computer screen while she searched through mugshots of felons from Florida, and amazingly, she actually found a photo of a man who bore a striking resemblance to Michael Clark Duncan. His name? Robert Foster. Foster had quite a huge criminal record, as he had a history of armed robbery and had escaped from prison on numerous occasions. So investigator Carty asked a retired Pinellas County Sheriff's Captain turned private investigator named Calvin Denny to find him. When he did, she personally spoke on the phone with Robert Foster, a guy whom the police claimed did not exist. She also uncovered documentation which showed that Foster had been paroled from a North Carolina prison and delivered to Orange County, Florida by sheriff's deputies in August 1975. And Foster's parole was subsequently terminated on January 15, 1976, which just happened to be the day before Tommy Zeigler's preliminary hearing. Of course, after spending the last 4 decades denying these facts, Don Fry has finally admitted that Robert Foster does exist, and that an armed robbery did take place at the Gulf gas station on Christmas Eve. Of course, Fry has changed his story numerous times, as he initially claimed that his secretary made the typographical error on the arrest report, then admitted that he was the one who made the mistake during his testimony, but now claims it was one of his deputies who screwed up. However, Fry still maintains that neither Foster nor the robbery have anything to do with the murders. Of course, Tommy Zeigler is now convinced that Foster was one of the men who attacked him and threw him around the store. The prevalent theory from Tommy's supporters is that Foster was originally intended to be one of the star witnesses against him instead of Felton Thomas, which would explain why his name was in the original paperwork. The problem was that Foster was a convicted felon with an extensive criminal history who was on parole at that time, so Zeigler's defense team would not have much difficulty tearing apart his credibility. So by the time the preliminary hearing arrived, Felton Thomas was now testifying as the star witness, and the police acted like Foster did not even exist, even though his name was already on the record. The explanation that the whole thing was just a simple clerical error does not hold much water, because Robert Foster's name was published in numerous newspaper articles during a 3-week period. Given what a high-profile murder case this was, it seems pretty unbelievable that not one person from the police force noticed that the wrong name of a witness kept getting published in the papers for 3 straight weeks. You'd think that someone would have contacted the Orlando Sentinel-Star and forced them to make a correction if there was actually an error in those articles. All the documentation and the newspaper articles featuring Foster's name are available for viewing at TommyZeiglerIsInnocent.com, so it's indisputable that these so-called mistakes happened. The website even features a photograph of a crowd gathered around the furniture store after the murders, and you can see a large black man there who looks like Foster. It's also worth noting that Don Fry claimed that Charlie Mays' van was never processed for fingerprints, but investigator Cardy was able to uncover a fingerprint processing card receipt for this. And get this, the FBI admitted to burning and shredding some of the fingerprint evidence. An agent named Ruby Lee Ross stated that she burned photographs of some partial prints on one of the guns because they did not have enough points for a match. And of course, the defense team was pretty aghast to hear that, since these prints could have still been used to rule Tommy Zeigler out as a suspect. So if they actually destroy fingerprint evidence which was found in Mays' van, you can make an obvious conclusion here. Since Robert Foster was a convicted felon, his prints would have been on the record. So how would the police explain his prints being in the van if he did not exist? Now, of course, all records of this attempted armed robbery at the Gulf Station were hidden from the defense at trial, but would you believe another strange incident occurred directly across the street from the furniture store on the night of the murders? This one went down on a police report as an averted armed robbery, and this report did not even see the light of day until investigator Cardy uncovered it a few years ago. The incident took place at approximately 9:10 p.m. on Christmas Eve at a TG&Y variety store, which also happened to be located in the same plaza as the Kentucky Fried Chicken where Edward Williams was seen. The manager at the TG&Y was planning to leave the store and make a money drop, and notified the police so they could have an escort for this. A police officer named Cindy Blaylock arrived on the scene, but she was forced to abandon the money drop after receiving a radio call that there was a robbery in progress at the Zeigler Furniture Store. She was told to go cover the back of the store and sped away in her patrol car. That's when some witnesses took note of a group of black males who had been hanging around the plaza. These black males suddenly climbed into a dark blue car and drove off, and the witnesses mistakenly believed that the men were chasing after the officer, so they notified the police. Of course, the witnesses had misinterpreted the situation, but it wound up going down on the record as an averted armed robbery. Now let's get back to John Jellison's sighting of the police officer behind the furniture store between 8:15 and 8:30. It's entirely possible that Cindy Blaylock may have been the police officer he saw. Since Blaylock had short hair, Jellison could have easily mistaken her for a male from a distance. Of course, the timeline doesn't match, but investigator Cardy actually provided a possible explanation for that. The Jellison family were in Florida on vacation and had traveled from another state in a different time zone. So it's possible that John Jellison's internal clock was off, or he forgot to adjust his watch or something, so when he said he saw the officer sometime between 8:15 and 8:20, he could have actually been an hour behind, lending credence to the theory that he saw Officer Blaylock. This is only a theory, mind you, and it might not be accurate at all, but it would provide some sort of logical explanation for the sighting of that mysterious police officer, as I've never been able to figure out how that detail fit into the overall puzzle. But let's get back to the averted armed robbery. Zeigler's defense team was never told about it, and even though Officer Blaylock testified at the trial, no mention was ever made of this incident. But there is a police report which proves this incident did happen, and it is also available for viewing at TommyZeiglerIsInnocent.com. If those black males were involved in the furniture store murders, it's been theorized that they were waiting to meet someone at the plaza, but took off once they saw the police car. But here's the biggest revelation from the incident report. The tag number of the dark blue vehicle those men were driving was listed, and it was traced to an address for an apartment building. Well, if you look at the trial testimony, Frank Smith, the guy who claimed he purchased untraceable guns for Tommy Zeigler, he claimed he lived at that very address at the time he ordered the guns. So once you take into account the attempted armed robbery at the gas station, the averted armed robbery at the TGNY, and the proven existence of Robert Foster, then it becomes clear that something very strange is at work here. However, none of this new information was enough to overturn Zeigler's conviction or garner him a new trial. The case continued to remain in the spotlight, and in 1992, Philip Finch published a book about it called Fatal Flaw, which, like I said earlier, is the source for most of the information I've shared with you in part 1 of this podcast. But there were a lot more new developments in this case after Fatal Flaw was published. Most importantly, the defense began to utilize DNA testing, which was not available at the time the original murders took place. DNA testing was finally performed on the blood found on Tommy's shirt. Because it was type A blood, everyone just assumed that it belonged to Perry Edwards. Well, you know who else had type A blood? Charlie Mays. And DNA testing would reveal that all the type A blood on the shirt belonged to Mays, not Perry Edwards. This meant that the state's account of Tommy holding his father-in-law in a headlock while beating his skull with a metal crank was not true. Of course, the presence of Charlie Mays' blood on Tommy's shirt did not prove his innocence or guilt, since the state also believed that Tommy beat Mays to death, and Tommy claimed he got into a violent struggle with intruders, so there are multiple explanations for how Mays' blood could have ended up there. But there was another interesting revelation. Type A blood had been found on Mays' pant leg, but DNA testing showed that some of this blood belonged to Perry Edwards. Since the state claimed that Perry was beaten and murdered before Mays even set foot in the store, this did not jibe with their case. On multiple occasions, Zeigler's defense team has presented this new DNA evidence to the appeals court, with hopes of overturning his conviction and getting a new trial. But each time, they have been rejected by the same circuit court judge, Reginald Whitehead, who does not believe this evidence is strong enough to cast doubt over the original conviction. But some controversy occurred during a 2004 hearing in front of Judge Whitehead. Since the 1980s, the prosecuting attorney handling the Zeigler case has been Jeff Ashton, who is a pretty recognizable name in the legal world since he was the prosecutor at the Casey Anthony trial. At the aforementioned hearing in 2004, Ashton referenced a piece of evidence which was found in the furniture store after the murders, the fingertip of a rubber glove. It was never linked to anybody, but Ashton stated that Tommy Zeigler's fingerprint had been found in the glove tip, which was just not true. No fingerprints were found in the glove tip at all, but unfortunately, Zeigler's defense team at the hearing failed to challenge this point. Ashton also made another inaccurate statement when he said that Tommy secretly purchased a life insurance policy for his wife, but it was actually no secret at all, as Eunice and her family were well aware of the policy, and Eunice's signature was on the application. Oh, and here's where things get truly ridiculous. When Charlie Mays' body was found, his pants were partially pulled down, so Ashton tried to infer that Zeigler had attempted to perform a sex act on the corpse, which I guess was supposed to tie into all these homosexuality rumors about him. Well, as you know, Judge Whitehead ultimately denied the motion for a new trial, and Zeigler's defenders have always argued that the false statements Ashton made about the evidence at this hearing may have unfairly influenced the judge's decision. In recent years, Lynn Marie Cardy actually wrote a complaint to the Florida Bar about Ashton's conduct. Their response was that since Ashton was an elected state attorney, the Florida Bar could not govern elected officials, even if they were still a lawyer. Of course, that still doesn't change the fact that Ashton was not an elected state attorney back in 2004 when this originally happened. But we'll talk about Mr. Ashton again a little later. So Zeigler continued to languish on death row while his supporters fought for his freedom, but some genuine concern was formed in 2013 when Florida Governor Rick Scott signed the Timely Justice Act, a new law which is intended to speed up executions by carrying them out a very short time after a death row's inmates' appeals have been exhausted. By this point, It had been nearly 3 decades since Tommy was in any serious danger of being executed, but his supporters now fear that in spite of Tommy's advanced age, this new speeding up of Florida's death penalty process could lead to his execution actually being carried out sometime down the line. So there's been a major push in recent years to get Tommy off death row, and the case will just not die. And that's when Lynn Marie Carty became involved in the case and started the website TommyZeiglerisInnocent.com. A new documentary was also made about this story titled A Question of Innocence, which aired on Investigation Discovery 2 years ago. Since it seemed like the new DNA evidence wasn't going to earn Tommy a new trial, investigator Carty knew she would have to do some serious legwork and uncover new evidence to build a strong circumstantial case supporting Tommy's innocence. I already discussed earlier how she was able to prove the existence of Robert Foster. After hearing some false info that Felton Thomas was dead, she discovered that he was actually still alive and was able to interview him in September 2013. And believe it or not, he actually recanted parts of his original story. He still maintains that he traveled to the furniture store with Charlie Mays and went to the orange grove to fire some guns, but now says that he never personally touched or fired any of the guns, which contradicts his original testimony. But Thomas's most interesting revelation is that the police never asked him to formally identify Zeigler as the man he interacted with. They didn't have him pick out Zeigler from a photo lineup or anything. They just told Thomas to say that Zeigler was the guy, and he went along with it. But that's not the most shocking revelation to emerge in recent years. Remember who got all those rumors started about Tommy's homosexuality? Eunice's brother, Perry Edwards Jr. In the book Fatal Flaw, Perry Jr. is barely given a mention because they did not know at the time that he was the one sharing all those rumors with the police. But since Perry Jr. passed away in 2013, some startling information about him has come to light. Perry Jr. was a violent man known for being abusive towards his family, and in 1975 his relationship with his father and mother had become so strained that his father was apparently planning to cut him out of his will. At Thanksgiving dinner that year, Perry Sr. approached Tommy with the idea of making him the new executor of his will instead of Perry Jr. But Perry Sr. wound up being murdered before the will could be officially changed. With Perry Sr., Virginia, and Eunice now dead, this left Perry Jr. as the sole beneficiary of the Edwards family estate, and he inherited $3.3 million. I'm sure you see where this is going. The defense's new theory is that Perry Edwards Jr. orchestrated the murders of his entire family. It's possible that he also intended to kill Tommy as well, and caught a lucky break when the police zeroed in on Tommy as the prime suspect. So Perry Jr. decided to strengthen the police's case by feeding them false stories about Tommy's homosexuality and Eunice's plans to end their marriage and return to Georgia with their parents. After hearing that, investigators were more certain than ever that Tommy was their man, so he wound up taking the rap for Perry Jr.'s crime. Now, is there any evidence to support these allegations? Well, records show that in August 1975, Perry Sr. and Virginia signed their will out of the courthouse where it was being stored. Up until that point, they had not removed it since 1967. The will was subsequently returned to the courthouse by Perry Jr. on January 7, 1976, allowing him to become the sole executor. And incidentally, he decided to do this on the very same day Eunice was buried, and he did not even attend her funeral. Like Charlie Mays and Robert Foster, Perry Jr. was heavily involved in softball. He worked as a deputy prison warden and coached the prison softball team, so it's possible he might have crossed paths with the suspects at some point. It's also worth noting that many members of Felton Thomas's family, including his mother and sister, lived in Moultrie, Georgia, Perry Jr.'s hometown, and Thomas himself was born one town over in Pelham. And remember that witness, Barbara Woodard, who said she saw a white man in the furniture store doorway on the night of the murders? Well, Tommy Zeigler and Perry Edwards Jr. resembled each other at that time, so it's possible the white man she saw could have actually been Perry Jr. Being a very religious minister, Perry Edwards Sr. did not approve of long hair or facial hair, yet by the time Perry Jr. traveled to Jacksonville for the trial, He was sporting long hair and a thick mustache. You could take that as a sign he was just trying to spite his late father, or it could be seen as an attempt to protect himself in case the wrong person in Winter Garden recognized him from somewhere. And remember how one of Eunice's diamond rings seemed to go missing from her hand after the murders? Years later, Perry Jr.'s 13-year-old granddaughter Nicole claimed she witnessed her nanny putting a ring in a safe deposit box at a bank. The nanny told Nicole that the ring had belonged to her Aunt Eunice and would be hers once she got older. Of course, if that was one of the same rings Eunice was wearing when she was killed, then Nicole's story is pretty troubling. So how would the so-called murder plot unfold? Did Perry Jr. hire the likes of Edward Williams, Charlie Mays, Robert Foster, and Felton Thomas to murder his family? Was he present at the murders himself? Well, apparently, Perry Jr. and Virginia had originally planned to take Perry Jr.'s daughter with them to Winter Garden for the Christmas holidays. But when they stopped at Perry Jr.'s house in Moultrie to pick their granddaughter up, his wife told them she was no longer able to go and made some sort of cryptic statement like, "There might be trouble down there." After the murders, the husband of Lizzie Parker, a woman who worked as a teacher's aide with Virginia Edwards, traveled to Perry Jr.'s home in Moultrie to deliver the news about his family. He claimed that Perry Jr.'s reaction was very strange, and that he acted like he already knew this had happened. Incidentally, Lizzie Parker also mentioned that Virginia was very excited to be spending the holidays with Tommy and Eunice, which seems to go against the theory that Eunice was planning to enter marriage and return home to Georgia with her parents. Like I mentioned earlier, there are many documented cases of abuse from Perry Jr. towards his family, which include punching his daughter while she was pregnant and forcing her to have an abortion. Perry Jr.'s wife finally divorced him in 1984, but she later went back to him after her new lover passed away, and she's apparently remained pretty tight-lipped about Perry Jr. since his death. And there were some shady things surrounding Perry Jr. from the time of the original investigation. When questioned by defense investigators, Perry Jr. continuously denied talking to the police, but years later, they uncovered a report written by Robert Thompson, the police chief of the adjoining town of Oakland, who mentioned speaking to Perry Jr. Perry Jr. also claimed to have a letter in his possession written by Eunice, where she discussed Tommy being involved in a secret homosexual ring with 26 other prominent residents of Winter Garden, but this alleged letter never surfaced. Another interesting tidbit about Perry Jr. from the original investigator notes is when he was asked about the Oldsmobile Tommy was driving on the night of the murders. Perry Jr. was asked how many times Tommy drove the car to Moultrie, and Perry Jr. answered that Tommy had driven it there 3 times, which did not make much sense because the car belonged to Curtis Dunaway, and Tommy was just borrowing it, so he'd had no need to drive it to Georgia 3 times. It's been theorized that Perry Jr. lied about that in order to provide a possible explanation if his fingerprints happened to be found in Dunaway's car. However, given that an FBI agent openly admitted to destroying some of the fingerprint evidence they found, it's possible they also could have done this to prints found in the Oldsmobile. So the fight to clear Tommy Zeigler's name still goes on. His case is currently being reviewed by Northwestern University's Medill Justice Project, who are also hoping to get some evidence retested. But just as I started preparing this podcast back in July, that same circuit court judge, Reginald Whitehead, denied the latest request to do further DNA testing on the bloodstains from Tommy Zeigler's clothing. So for the moment, Tommy and his supporters are back at square one, and I guess you could say the trail went cold. So I wasn't lying when I said this would be our longest, most convoluted episode yet. I've studied a lot of cases involving controversial convictions, but I can't recall too many others where it's been this difficult to form a concrete theory about what happened. When you look at all the evidence and the differing timelines from the night of the murders, it is impossible to come up with a theory supporting Zeigler's innocence or guilt, which makes 100% complete sense. I will say, though, that if Tommy Zeigler is innocent, then this case has got to be one of the biggest miscarriages of justice ever. The man has been on death row for 40 years, which is more time than he's lived on this earth as a free man, He's 71 years old now, but he looks like he could be 90, as 4 decades on death row do not age a person well. When you see Tommy Zeigler today, you see this frail, soft-spoken old man, and it's hard to visualize him being a sociopathic multiple murderer. But of course, appearances can be deceiving. It's quite ironic that Judge Maurice Paul made the controversial decision to overturn the jury's recommendation for a life sentence and impose the death penalty, because it's pretty much ended up being a life sentence for Tommy anyway. For the past few decades, he's essentially been trapped in limbo, as the state is paranoid about the potential backlash if they execute him, but also paranoid about the potential fallout if they admit they made a colossal mistake and then release him. Before I re-examine the evidence and provide my analysis, I will reiterate that regardless of whether Tommy is guilty or innocent, he did not receive a fair trial. The conflict of interest with Judge Paul, that alone should have been enough to garner Tommy a new trial. But either way, the jury should not have convicted him on the evidence they were presented, as there was way too much reasonable doubt about his guilt. As much as they tried, the prosecution was unable to provide a smoking gun to definitively prove that Tommy Zeigler committed these crimes. But here's what's so interesting about this case. Even though his supporters have uncovered a lot of compelling evidence to provide reasonable doubt about Zeigler's guilt, they've never really uncovered that one crucial exculpatory piece of evidence to prove his innocence. At trial, the burden of proof is on the prosecution, but once someone's been convicted, the burden of proof is on the defense. As questionable as Zeigler's conviction may be, the case is far too convoluted to establish with 100% certainty that he is an innocent man. But I will try to theorize about what I think is the most likely verdict. For starters, I'll say that even if Zeigler is guilty of the 4 murders, I find it highly unlikely that it went down exactly as the prosecution described. If the state's version was true, then Zeigler orchestrated the most needlessly complicated murder scheme in history. There had to be a much simpler way for him to pull this off, but in order to make their case, the state had to concoct this very elaborate scenario because it was the only way to piece together all the known facts. So let's talk about motive. $500 in life insurance sounds like a pretty good motive, but not if you're already rich. In essence, Tommy Zeigler was living the perfect life at that time. He was financially well off, seemed to be happily married, and was a very well-liked and respected member of his community. Why screw all that up by committing murder? And if you want to murder your wife for the insurance money, why complicate things by also murdering your in-laws? Why not murder Eunice on another day when her parents aren't in town? To me, the biggest hole in the life insurance motive is that just 1 month earlier, Perry Edwards Sr. proposed the idea of making Tommy the executor of his will. Tommy didn't know Perry Jr. that well, but he knew he had a reputation for being a major troublemaker and had a strained relationship with his own family. Tommy figured there might be potential trouble if he replaced Perry Jr. as the executor, which is why he was reluctant to accept his father-in-law's request. However, Perry Sr. brought the will with him when he came to visit the Zeiglers in Winter Garden for Christmas. When they arrived on December 23rd, he presented the will to Tommy, and even though Tommy was still resistant, Perry Jr. was planning to use the rest of the holidays to convince his son-in-law to become the new executor. But then, if you believe the state, Tommy murdered his father-in-law before the will could be changed. So now, even though Tommy has gained $500,000 in life insurance, he's cost himself an extra $3.3 million. The only way this scenario makes sense is if there was any truth to the rumors that Tommy was a closet homosexual and that Eunice was planning to end the marriage and head back home with her parents. This would give Tommy a strong motive to murder Eunice, Perry, and Virginia at the same time. Tommy had a very conservative religious image, and being outed as a homosexual in a conservative town like Winter Garden during the 1970s would do serious damage to his reputation. That would be a logical reason for him to kill his father-in-law before the will could be changed. Yet all we have to support these homosexuality rumors is a bunch of hearsay from Perry Edwards Jr. and one of Eunice's friends, but no corroborating evidence that any of the rumors are true. Okay, so in order to make sense out of this whole thing, we have to go back to discussing the Rashomon effect, and analyze the multiple versions of events which occurred between 7 p.m. and 9:18 p.m. on Christmas Eve in 1975. We have 3 different stories from Tommy Zeigler, Felton Thomas, and Edward Williams. And I have to say that out of all of them, Tommy Zeigler's story is the one which makes the most sense. For the most part, his account of the events is pretty straightforward and logical. He has not changed his story since day one, and even 40 years of perspective have not opened up any serious flaws or holes in his story. That said, there's one part of Tommy's story which I've always found concerning. When Edward Williams was late showing up at his house, Tommy claimed he drove off to pick up some bourbon at a nearby store, but then changed his mind and turned around and went back home. The problematic part is that this probably would have happened while Eunice and her parents were getting killed at the furniture store. So technically, Tommy's whereabouts cannot be verified during the exact time frame these murders took place. Driving halfway to a store and then turning around to drive back home, that's a pretty weak alibi. It's certainly not implausible that it could have gone down that way, but it still sounds awfully convenient and contrived. But one point in Tommy's favor is that he was able to stick with his original story while under the influence of Brevitol sodium, aka truth serum. Now, I'm no expert on truth serum, but from my research, the way it works is that it slows down the speed at which your body sends messages from your spinal cord to your brain. This makes it more difficult to perform high-functioning tasks, which would include lying. I can see why these sorts of tests would not be admissible in court, as you cannot say with 100% certainty that a person is incapable of lying while under the influence of these drugs. There is no hard evidence that these tests actually work, which is why they're rarely used today. That said, if Tommy's story is a complete lie, it's a very elaborate lie. And unless Tommy was a compulsive liar who had tons of practices with fabricating false stories, I think it would be pretty difficult to keep all the details of his story straight while he was undergoing a truth serum test. But like I mentioned earlier, all the video footage of this session is available on YouTube, so you can watch them and judge for yourself. So let's move on to Felton Thomas's version of events. There's one aspect of his story which doesn't make sense, and even the prosecution was never able to explain it. According to Thomas, after he and May showed up and parked their van behind the furniture store, Zeigler drove up to meet them in a car. But according to the prosecution's version of events, Zeigler was murdering 3 people inside the store less than 10 minutes earlier. So where was he driving from? Remember, a bullet stopped one of the store's clocks at exactly 7:24, and Mays and Thomas arrived at approximately 7:30. So in about 6 minutes, the Zeigler finished committing the murders, exit the store, drive somewhere else, and then show up to meet them? There's also a considerable problem with the story that Mays was showing up at the furniture store that night to pick up a television set. His van was found parked in the rear lot of the adjacent Winter Garden Inn, which was separated from the store by a 6-foot chain-link fence. If you're there to pick up a TV set and transfer it into your van, why would you park behind a fence? There are so many places Mays could have parked right next to the store if he was planning to pick something up. And then there's the fact that Thomas got quite a few details wrong. He said that Zeigler showed up in a light-colored Cadillac when he would have been driving Curtis Dunaway's Oldsmobile. He claimed that Zeigler was wearing light-colored clothing, but he was not that night. And when they traveled to the Zeigler home, Thomas said he saw a car parked in the driveway, but technically, he should have seen Edward Williams' pickup truck, not a car. He also said Zeigler went into the garage to retrieve the box of ammunition, but Williams would say Zeigler entered into the house. And let's not forget that Zeigler wasn't even supposed to show up at the store that night. Considering that Thomas wasn't part of his original plan, Zeigler adapted remarkably well once he found out that Mays brought along an extra guy with him. And it's amazing that when Thomas chose not to accompany Zeigler and Mays into the store, Zeigler did absolutely nothing to stop him, even though Thomas could potentially blow apart his entire cover story, which, incidentally, is exactly what he did. Of course, Thomas recanted parts of his story when defense investigators re-interviewed him a few years ago, but an interesting possibility entered their minds. Since Tommy Zeigler and Perry Edwards Jr. resembled each other, what if Thomas's story might actually be true, and Perry Jr. was the white man who approached him and Charlie Mays? Remember, Thomas claimed he never met Tommy Zeigler beforehand, so he could have been mistaken about who he saw. However, defense investigators did show Thomas some photos of Perry Jr., and he never really confirmed or denied knowing him. His response was basically, "I don't know that man by no mustache, no." But Thomas did act very nervous and agitated when Perry Jr.'s name came up. I gotta say, I've never been entirely sure what to make of Felton Thomas. On the surface, it looks like he only became a witness at the last second to replace Robert Foster, so I couldn't decide if Thomas was always part of the original plan, or if he was simply the wrong guy in the wrong place at the wrong time. We're going to get back to Thomas's interview in a little while, but here's another interesting tidbit he shared. Thomas claimed that the white man he interacted with was spitting up a lot. Someone actually spit up and threw up outside the passenger side door of the Edwards' sedan that night. According to investigator Carty, this sample was collected and would probably contain the DNA of one of the real killers if it was ever tested. And it's also worth mentioning that Perry Sr.'s wallet was found in his sedan, and it was empty, lending even more credence to the theory that a robbery had taken place. Now, before we talk about Edward Williams, I have to address the testimony of Don and Rita Fickey, which I almost regard to be the elephant in the room in the case against Tommy Zeigler. The Fickeys claimed that Curtis Dunaway's car was not parked in the garage the first 2 times they visited the Zeigler home, but they saw it the last time they went there at around 8:40, 8:45. If true, this would poke a major hole in Tommy's story and support the prosecution's version of events. And remember, even though Don Fickey was the town's police chief, he was also one of Tommy's closest friends. I should also mention that Fickey did not even particularly like the host of the Christmas party he was attending, and only went there because Tommy invited him. Tommy also requested that Fickey post a bulletin about the Christmas party at the police station, inviting all officers to attend. Hell, Tommy even convinced Oakland Police Chief Robert Thompson to go to the party, even though Tommy didn't even know him that well. Investigators took this as an indication that Tommy wanted as many police officers as possible to be at this party, so they'd be off the streets and he'd have free rein to carry out his elaborate murder plot without their interference. In most ordinary cases, I might take the Fickeys' testimony as a damning evidence of Tommy's guilt. But as you probably know, this is no ordinary case. To be fair, near the end of Fatal Flaw, Tommy's attorneys do provide a possible explanation for this situation. They believe the real perpetrators traveled to his house and then drove Curtis Dunaway's car to the furniture store, so it would look like Tommy drove there himself. This was all part of their attempted frame-up job, and would explain why one of the guns from the furniture store was found in Dunaway's car. The problem was that Edward Williams' pickup truck had a bad carburetor at the time and wouldn't start. Since they couldn't drive Williams' truck away from the murder scene, Williams would now have to admit he drove Tommy to the store to explain why his truck was parked there. So they ended up driving Dunaway's car back to the Zeigler home and parking it in the garage. This would explain why the Fickeys did not see the vehicle the first 2 times they were there, but then saw it at 8:45. I gotta admit, the first time I read that, it just sounded way too convoluted for me. It also wouldn't explain why Fickey claimed he saw Williams' pickup truck parked in the driveway at 8:35 with a black man sitting inside. If the defense's explanation were true, Williams' pickup truck should have already been broken down at the store by this point. But there's another strange complication I haven't even told you about yet. A neighbor named Edward Reeves, who lived across the street from the Zeigler home, he claimed he left his house at around 8 o'clock on Christmas Eve and saw a dark-colored car parked in the Zeigler driveway. When Reeves returned about 40 minutes later, he said this dark-colored car was still parked there. So how does this car fit into the whole thing? I swear to God, I can't remember another case where so many different witnesses contradicted each other and poked holes in both the defense and the prosecution's case. If Edward Reeves is telling the truth, then this would technically help support Tommy Zeigler's story and totally contradict Williams and the Fickeys. Since the eyewitness accounts in this case are all over the map, I just cannot consider the Ficky's testimony to be a smoking gun. It's also worth noting that in the original investigator notes, Edward Reeves's son goes on the record as saying that Chief Ficky threatened to charge his father with perjury if he was lying about seeing the car, which caused great strain on Reeves since he had recently had surgery after 2 heart attacks. But in spite of this inconsistency, there's one point which works in Tommy's favor. If he was planning to commit the murders, why would he have agreed to accompany the Fickies to the Christmas party that night? Remember, Tommy's story was that he was going to present the Edwardses with a recliner at the store and then make a pair of deliveries with Williams. And incidentally, one of those deliveries was a potted plant for Don Ficky, so it makes total sense that he would meet up with the Fickies after he completed his deliveries. It certainly makes more sense than carrying out an elaborate murder plot which required him to travel back and forth to his house multiple times. His whole plot would completely unravel if he happened to bump into the Fickies at any point during this time. But now let's start talking about Edward Williams. There are just so many things wrong with his story. It seems unbelievable enough that Williams would just hang around the Zeigler home for nearly an hour on Christmas Eve, waiting for Zeigler to accompany him to the furniture store. It doesn't make sense that Don Ficky would report walking past Williams in his pickup truck when he went to knock on the door, yet Williams never mentioned this at all in his statement. But his account of what happened at the furniture store is just absurd. If Zeigler committed all those murders, I just don't believe he would have let Williams escape so easily, at least not the way Williams described. Even if Zeigler's gun didn't work, I can't believe that he would just place the weapon in Williams's hand and not do everything in his power to stop him. I guess it's possible that Zeigler might let Felton Thomas run away, because Thomas wasn't part of his original plan to begin with. But killing Williams and framing him for the murders was absolutely essential to his plan. Otherwise, he would have 2 independent witnesses who could go to the police with stories which completely contradicted his version of events, which is exactly what happened. It also doesn't make much sense that Williams would run all the way across the street to the Kentucky Fried Chicken to use the phone. After he climbed over the chain-link fence, he was in the parking lot of the Winter Garden Inn, and he could have just sought help right there. The whole episode at the KFC is the most problematic part of Williams' story. Virtually every eyewitness places Williams at the KFC between 20 to 40 minutes after his episode at the furniture store supposedly took place. Since the Nolans saw him at around the exact moment the police showed up at 9:21, their particular time frame cannot be wrong. Remember, Williams claimed he left the scene and hitched a ride out of town because he couldn't get through to the police. But if the Nolans' claims are accurate, then Williams would have been there right when the police arrived. If Williams was a completely innocent victim, and Tommy Zeigler had just tried to kill him, why wouldn't he just approach the police right then and there, rather than taking off and disappearing for several hours? And the clothing Williams turned into the police was clearly different than the clothes he wore at the furniture store, as his shoes had no scuff marks, his pockets had no trace of gunshot residue, and all the witnesses at the KFC described him wearing different colored clothes. Add in the fact that Williams' truck was found at the store, and he had one of the murder weapons in his possession, and it's quite amazing that the police just took him at his word and didn't think he was involved. It's worth noting that Williams' truck was dealing with a bad carburetor at the time. Whatever happened inside the store, I would not be surprised if Williams left his truck behind because it wouldn't start. I think that's what caused him to go into panic mode and run over to the KFC. Otherwise, I don't think he would have turned himself into the police at all. But since his truck was parked at a location where 4 murders had taken place, he had no choice but to come forward and provide an explanation, and he probably disappeared for several hours in order to dream up a cover story for himself. Edward Williams has since passed away, so we may never know the full truth about his actions that night. I think the key is determining Charlie Mays' role in this whole thing. Was he truly an innocent victim, or was he a willing participant in a murder/robbery? Well, at the time, Mays was a pretty well-liked figure in the town's black community, and most people had a hard time believing that this hard-working family man could be involved in murder. But there were also rumors that Mays had gambling debts, which, if true, might make him desperate enough to be roped into something illegal. But here's an interesting point to discuss. When Mays visited the furniture store that morning, He was accompanied by his wife and Brian Ned, a 16-year-old black kid who worked on his fruit-picking crew. Mays actually did have an arrest record for gambling, because he once gambled away the paychecks of his fruit-picking crews, and it was Tommy who loaned him the money to help him out of this jam. Now, Mrs. Mays claimed her husband told her he'd made arrangements to return to the store that night to pick up the TV set, but she could only take his word for it. But Brian Ned? He claimed he actually overheard a conversation between Mays and Zeigler where they made those arrangements. Now, on the Unsolved Mysteries message board, the Cars 1986 made an excellent point which caused me to do a double take for a moment. In his deposition, Brian Ned testified that he heard Zeigler tell Mays to meet him at the store after closing to pick up the TV set. If this is true, then that would lend considerable credence to the story that Zeigler was guilty, because Zeigler always denied that such an arrangement had been made. Brian Ned is mentioned during the first several pages of Fatal Flaw, but even though the book offers a rebuttal for most of the evidence against Zeigler, it doesn't have an explanation for Ned's testimony, which seems pretty strange. Why would this kid have any motivation to lie? Well, the only other mention of Ned in the book is a brief description of him getting into a shoving match with one of the investigators on Zeigler's defense team, but unfortunately, it doesn't provide any explanation for this altercation. However, the book makes it very clear that the majority of Winter Garden's black community thought Zeigler was guilty right from the outset, and felt betrayed by the fact that he had befriended Charlie Mays and decided to murder him. So I wouldn't consider it a stretch to think that an impressionable 16-year-old kid like Brian Ned might decide to lie about overhearing that conversation in order to strengthen the case against Zeigler. Now, I really don't know anything about Ned or his character, but I am offering up one possible explanation for why he might lie about what he heard. Or maybe Ned didn't deliberately lie and just misunderstood what he heard. Maybe Zeigler and Mays did discuss picking up the TV set at a later time without specifically saying they would do it that very night. Remember, Winter Garden was still a pretty segregated town back then, so I wouldn't put it past the police to pressure a young black kid into embellishing his story a little bit, so that it would make Zeigler look more guilty. It's also worth noting that in 1982, a retired law enforcement officer named Ed Rowe claimed that Charlie Mays' son Ernie told him that his father had a gun on him when he left their home on Christmas Eve, while telling his family there would be money for Christmas. Ernie then allegedly said, "My father wasn't supposed to die that night. Tommy Zeigler was supposed to die." Of course, Ernie denied this conversation ever took place, but Ed Rowe did sign an affidavit to back up his statement. But there's also been another interesting story in recent years provided by Edward Williams' landlady, Mary Wallace, whom, as you'll recall, was the same woman who confirmed that Robert Foster and Charlie Mays knew each other. Wallace is also a retired police dispatcher, and her husband worked for the Winter Garden Recreation Department in 1975. According to Wallace, a few days after the murders, her husband and another employee from the department were asked to remove a corn plant from the furniture store and deliver it to Chief Don Fickey. Both men claimed they saw a bloody gun inside the corn plant, but after it was delivered to Fickey, no one ever saw this weapon again. Aside from the 2 unregistered weapons purchased from Frank Smith, all the guns found at the murder scene belonged to Tommy Zeigler. So if Charlie Mays brought a gun to the store, what happened to it? Well, Zeigler's supporters speculate that this mysterious bloody gun in the corn plant might have belonged to Mays. But here's the big thing which bothers me about the state's assertion that Zeigler set up Mays to take the fall for the murders. Near the end of Fatal Flaw, Philip Finch lists a ton of things which don't make sense about Zeigler's murder plot, but there was one unanswered question which really stuck out to me. What was Tommy Zeigler's plan if Charlie Mays hadn't shown up at his store that morning? The prosecution gave off the impression that Tommy was a diabolical individual who planned this elaborate murder plot well in advance, which would explain why he ordered those untraceable guns 6 months beforehand. Tommy originally made arrangements for Edward Williams to accompany him to the store on December 22nd, so you have to assume that by this point, he had already concocted his plan to murder his wife and his in-laws at the store on Christmas Eve and frame Williams for the crime. Yet for the next 2 days, there is no indication that Tommy ever approached Charlie Mays or anyone else to meet him at the store on Christmas Eve. If you believe the state's version, when Mays showed up at the store on the morning of the 24th to purchase some linoleum, Tommy got the spontaneous idea, hey, maybe I'll set him up for the murders too, and then decided to invite Mays to the store that night under the guise of giving him a TV set so he could kill him. Considering that one of the most important elements of Tommy's plan was getting Mays to fire off the murder weapons at the Orange Grove, it's quite strange that he'd wait until the last minute to find himself a patsy. Once again, if Mays didn't show up at the store that morning, or if he told Tommy he couldn't meet him at the store that night, what was Tommy going to do? He spent the entire rest of the day working at the store, so when would he have time to find another patsy? Was he really planning to pin the entire crime on Edward Williams alone? And while we're on the subject of Williams, why would Tommy ask him to meet him at his house at 7:30, the exact same time he arranged to meet Mays at the store? How would his plan work if Williams didn't have the patience to wait around in his driveway for nearly an hour and then just decided to bail on him? It just seems crazy that Tommy could orchestrate this elaborate murder plot and leave so many things to chance. It seems like this plan of his required pitch-perfect timing when so many things could have gone wrong. The state even theorized that the reason Tommy offered to switch cars with Curtis Dunaway was because he'd have to travel back and forth a lot that night, and there would be less risk of him being recognized if he drove someone else's vehicle. Fair enough, but that doesn't change the fact that Dunaway's Oldsmobile was still having car trouble, and Tommy took a huge risk by borrowing it. If the car broke down while Tommy was in the midst of carrying out his murders, his entire plan was ruined. I might be more willing to believe Charlie Mays was an innocent victim if they hadn't discovered Perry Edwards' blood on his pants. Their bodies were found 15 yards apart from each other, and there weren't any bloody footprints between them, so I don't see how that blood could have wound up on Mays' pants if their paths hadn't crossed at some point. And of course, that goes completely against the state's assertion that Perry was murdered before Mays even entered the store. So I think I've pretty much established that I do not believe the state's version of events which happened that night. But does that mean Tommy Zeigler's innocent? Well, it is possible that he still could be guilty, but the actual murder plot was far less convoluted. One other theory is that Tommy could have hired Edward Williams, Charlie Mays, Felton Thomas, or some others to meet him at the store and murder Eunice and his in-laws for him. After they completed the job, Tommy then decides to double-cross his accomplices by shooting them inside the store and placing all the blame on them. However, Tommy only succeeds at killing Mays before the others shoot him and escape. I mean, there are a lot of holes in that theory, and I don't necessarily believe it, but I think it says a lot about the state's case that this particular version somehow seems a bit more plausible. Even if there was some truth to this theory, the state needed the testimony of Williams and Thomas to make their case, so there was no way they were going to present a scenario where either of them were willing participants in the murder. So if Tommy was a completely innocent victim, then who really was responsible for the murders? Well, as I mentioned earlier, the big theory Zeigler's supporters have pushed forward in recent years is that Perry Edwards Jr. was the mastermind behind the whole thing. Now, I gotta admit, I found it a bit troubling that they never pushed this theory until after Perry Jr. died in 2013. It seems awfully convenient that they started pointing fingers at the guy when he was no longer around to defend himself. But in fairness, I have been assured that there were plans to go public with these suspicions about Perry Jr. while he was alive, and it was just an unfortunate coincidence that he suddenly died of a heart attack. In fact, his granddaughter Nicole had apparently told him that he was being investigated, and reported seeing him burning some papers in a fire barrel shortly before his death. I will say, the theory about Perry Jr. orchestrating this whole thing is very compelling, and makes sense on the surface, but there was one unanswered question which initially prevented me from getting fully behind it. Did Perry Jr. know that his family was going to be in the furniture store that night? Remember, Eunice brought her parents to the store after closing because she and Tommy were going to provide them with a recliner. I can't be sure, but you'd assume that this was a Christmas surprise, and that Perry Sr. and Virginia wouldn't have known about it when they left their home in Moultrie. So did anyone from the Edwards family tell Perry Jr. this was going to happen? Because if not, then I don't know how Perry Jr. could have arranged this whole thing. This took place after the store was closed, so there would be no reason for Perry Jr. to think his family would be there at the time. For Perry Jr. to orchestrate this murder plot and recruit a bunch of accomplices, he'd need to have advanced knowledge of his family's whereabouts in order to make it work. And the connection between Perry Jr. and Charlie Mays and Robert Foster seemed very, very tenuous to me. Just because they all love to play softball is not evidence that they actually knew each other. The story about the nanny having possession of Eunice's ring is pretty interesting, but I did acknowledge the possibility that there might have been some sort of clerical error, and the police gave the ring back to Perry Jr. without making a record of it, which would make sense since he was the next of kin. However, I learned that Eunice's wedding ring was actually taped to her finger when her body was found to prevent it from getting lost. So if Eunice had been wearing her family ring, the same thing would have happened. So it seems pretty certain that this ring was taken from her before the police arrived. I will say that Lynn Marie Carty did address a lot of my misgivings about the theory that Perry Jr. was responsible. She suspects that Perry Jr.'s original plan was not to murder his family inside the furniture store after closing. It just sort of happened that way. It's possible the murders were actually supposed to take place at the Zeigler home earlier in the day. On Christmas Eve, there were numerous sightings of a dark blue car driving up and down the street in the Zeiglers' neighborhood throughout the day. If these were the killers, they very well could have followed Eunice and her parents from their home to the furniture store after closing and used that as the ideal opportunity to kill them. When Tommy showed up at the store shortly thereafter, they shot him too, but whether by design or pure luck, he wound up taking the rap for the murders. The thing about the dark blue car I just described is that it just seems to keep popping up throughout the day. A vehicle matching that description was seen parked in front of the furniture store that night by numerous witnesses, including Ken and Linda Roach, whom, as you'll recall, saw 4 vehicles outside the store when there theoretically should have only been 2. This car also seems to match the description of the vehicle Edward Reeves saw parked in the Zeiglers' driveway between 8 o'clock and 8:40. And it would also match the description of the vehicle the black males used to speed away from the TG&Y store during the averted armed robbery incident. Shortly after Tommy was arrested, a black man named Nathaniel Brown contacted Tommy's parents with a shocking piece of information. Brown claimed that an unknown white man had paid $1,000 each to a group of black males to commit some murders. 2 of these black men were named Don and Jerry. Robert Foster was known for using a number of aliases during his criminal career, one of which was Jerry Freeman. Brown also specifically mentioned Charlie Mays' name, and said he was planning to steal a TV set when he visited the furniture store that night. But the strange thing about Brown's story is that he claimed the murders were part of a revenge plot orchestrated by the white man against Tommy's father, Thomas Zeigler Sr., and that one of the reasons was because Mr. Zeigler had bested him on some property deals. Even though these people shot Tommy, Brown believed that they never intended to kill him and wanted to frame him for the crime, so that his parents would have to suffer the indignity of seeing their son get convicted of murder. Brown claimed he was a member of the NAACP and came forward because of Tommy Zeigler's reputation for being supportive of the black community. This info was turned over to the police, but Don Fry later dismissed Brown's story and claimed he was nothing more than a criminal and an habitual liar. When defense investigators attempted to find Brown later on, so he could testify at trial, they were told he had been killed in a shootout in New York City. When you look at the state attorney file, Nathaniel Brown did actually appear on the original witness list, but then they told the defense to remove him. Well, guess what? Reports of Brown's death were greatly exaggerated. Investigator Carty was able to uncover a death certificate for Nathaniel Brown, and it turns out he actually died in Florida in July of 2006. Brown's story is pretty unusual, as there's zero indication that these murders were a revenge scheme against Tommy's father. But one detail which added credibility to the story was his claim that all the guns used in the murders had been wiped clean, as this info was not known until weeks after Brown mentioned it. Well, investigator Carty believes that Brown was actually telling the truth, but that some of the details got lost in the translation. It's possible that Brown might have actually said, it was a revenge scheme against the father, and everyone incorrectly assumed the father was Thomas Zeigler Sr. But what if the father was actually Perry Edwards Sr.? When Brown said that the father had bested the mastermind of this plot on some property deals, that can be interpreted as him besting his own son. Because if Perry Sr. cut Perry Jr. out of his will, then he would no longer be able to inherit his family's farmland. Since Brown is now dead, we'll probably never know how he learned any of this information to begin with, but it sounds like he might have heard this story third hand and gotten some details mixed up. Because some of his inaccurate statements still have an element of truth to them. For example, he claimed that one of the black men, Jerry, had a glass eye, which doesn't apply to any of the known suspects. However, court transcripts show that Mary Ellen Stewart, the same witness who testified to arranging the purchase of untraceable guns between Tommy and Frank Smith, she mentioned that she only had one eye. Brown also claimed that Jerry had taken a bullet wound to his right shoulder and was currently recovering in Oakland, and while this detail doesn't seem to apply to Robert Foster or any of the other suspects, there's an element of truth to this too. Remember how Tommy claims that when he was attacked in the furniture store, he pulled out his .22 to defend himself, but the gun jammed? Well, Tommy did manage to get one shot off before his weapon jammed and it was knocked from his hands. What if this shot actually ended up wounding someone? Even though an empty .22 case was found at the scene, no .22 caliber bullets were recovered. This made the defense suspect that Tommy did manage to wound one of his attackers, and that this person left the store with a .22 bullet still inside them. And I suppose now would be an opportune time to mention the person who pointed Inspector Carty in the direction of Perry Edwards Jr. in the first place, a Georgia sheriff's deputy named Gene Jones. Well, Jones's son just happened to be the husband of Perry Jr.'s granddaughter, Nicole. Perry Jr. had threatened to kill his grandson-in-law, and Jones always thought there was something off about the guy, which is what compelled him to get in touch with investigator Carty. When Jones learned about Felton Thomas's description of the white guy he met on the night of the murders, he thought Thomas might be referring to a criminal named Edward Lee Bryant, who went by the nickname Slim. Slim had a reputation for being a drug-dealing hitman and just happened to hang out in the same Georgia bar as Perry Edwards Jr. He was also known to drive a car which resembled a light-colored Cadillac. This might explain the discrepancy in Thomas's story, where he claimed that Tommy Zeigler picked him up in a light-colored Cadillac, even though he should have been driving Curtis Dunaway's Oldsmobile at that time. There was another strange discrepancy in Thomas's trial testimony which was not followed up on by the defense. At one point, while describing his encounter with Zeigler, Thomas stated, and I quote, "I ain't paying too much attention because he was on the truck when everybody was trying to get their equipment sharpened there." This is a very odd statement because Thomas claimed that he never met Zeigler before he showed up at the furniture store. But now he's implying that he met him earlier? And why would Tommy be sharpening equipment? Well, here's where this Slim guy ties into the whole thing again. Slim actually ran a tool sharpening business for migrant workers who worked in the fields, which he would use as a cover to sell them drugs. And as you might recall, Felton Thomas worked as a migrant worker. During your interview with Thomas, investigator Carty showed him a photograph of Slim. And much like when he saw the photograph of Perry Jr., Thomas appeared to become visibly agitated. But here's the real interesting part. Gene Jones claims that around the same time as the murders, Slim got shot in the right shoulder with a .22, and Jones got this story directly from Slim's uncle, who was a prominent law enforcement officer. The story goes that Slim sustained this gunshot wound after a fight with a black guy named Bear. But Slim didn't seem to be too worried about pressing charges against the guy or getting payback. Now, as you remember, Nathaniel Brown claimed that a black guy involved in the murders was shot in the right shoulder. But what if he got that detail mixed up? Could Perry Edwards Jr. have entrusted Slim to help with his murder plot? Was Slim at the furniture store when the murders took place? Was Slim the white man that Felton Thomas interacted with that night? Did Tommy Zeigler fire a shot into Slim's right shoulder? It's certainly possible, but at this point, I've delivered so many pieces of information that my head is ready to explode. So, if you're just waiting for me to come up with a definitive theory which explains what actually happened at the W.T. Zeigler Furniture Store on Christmas Eve in 1975, well, I'm sorry to say, I don't think I can. The whole situation is such a ridiculous, convoluted mess that with all the evidence we have to work with, it's impossible to come up with a theory supporting Tommy Zeigler's innocence or guilt which doesn't have a bunch of holes. But if I had to choose one or the other, I would have to go with innocence. There's just too much about this case which doesn't make sense. There's just too many strange coincidences and too many things covered up by law enforcement to make me feel comfortable about Tommy's guilt. Something strange is definitely going on, and it seems more likely to me that someone else had to be responsible for these murders. I have to admit that I've gone back and forth on this issue many times over the years. I've discussed this case with fellow true crime buffs, and some of them have brought up some pretty compelling arguments about why they believe Tommy is guilty. It reached a point where the case got so convoluted that it became larger than life, and I started thinking that maybe Occam's razor was the answer here, and that Tommy did it, and that the right man was in prison. However, once I spoke with Lynn Marie Carty, the story got even more convoluted, and I started thinking, there's no way a murder case could get this complicated if they got the right guy. There's no way the police would flat out pretend that key figures like Robert Foster did not even exist if they didn't believe they screwed up and charged an innocent man. I think they developed tunnel vision and wouldn't look at any other possibilities besides Tommy Zeigler being the murderer. When Perry Edwards Jr. served as Don Fry's confidential informant and fed him all that info about Tommy being a homosexual, that sealed the deal for them. And once they charged Tommy with the crime, they passed the point of no return. Even when holes started to emerge in their theory and evidence started pointing to Tommy's innocence, they couldn't just admit they made a mistake and start over again. And unfortunately, that's what happens in so many wrongful conviction cases. When you look at the big picture, there's way more evidence supporting Tommy Zeigler's innocence than his guilt. So was Perry Edwards Jr. the real mastermind behind this horrible crime? In spite of my initial misgivings, it does sound like the most plausible explanation to me. I fully concede that I cannot provide an airtight explanation about why I think Tommy Zeigler's innocent, but here's the thing. The state of Florida cannot provide an airtight explanation about why they thought Tommy Zeigler was guilty. The case they presented in court left way too much room for reasonable doubt, so there's no way Tommy should have been convicted, let alone sentenced to death. I really hope that the Timely Justice Act doesn't pave the way to Tommy being executed. Even if he committed the murders, how much time does he have left anyway? Is there really much point to executing a man in his early 70s? At the very least, I do think that Tommy deserves a new trial. If Tommy Zeigler was guilty all along, well, he's been incarcerated for the past 40 years, so even though he's still alive, justice has technically been served. But if he was innocent, then this is one of the biggest miscarriages of justice of all time. It is the tragic and frightening tale of a man having his perfect life stolen away from him because the system went horribly wrong. But if you're a believer in Tommy Zeigler's innocence, I might have some hopeful news for you. Remember how I mentioned Jeff Ashton and his less than ethical behavior on this case? Well, the very day before part 1 of this podcast was released, Ashton was defeated in his re-election bid to become Orange Osceola State Attorney. His opponent was Eunice Zeigler, and her victory was considered a major upset. It was quite a remarkable coincidence because I had zero idea this election was even happening when I put this podcast together. From what I've heard, Eunice Zeigler has a lot more integrity than Jeff Ashton and genuinely wants to improve Florida's criminal justice system. So while Jeff Ashton has spent decades doing everything in his power to keep Tommy Zeigler in prison, Eunice Zeigler may have a much more open mind about looking into this case. So obviously, Tommy's story is not over yet, and there could be some potential developments in the near future. So once again, I would like to extend my deepest thanks to investigator Lynn Marie Carty for providing me with a lot of new information and helping me ensure that the information presented in this episode was as accurate as possible. And of course, A big thank you to her for spending the last few years of her life on a tireless crusade to uncover the truth. If you want to learn even more about this case, be sure to visit TommyZeiglerIsInnocent.com. There is so much more eye-opening information that I didn't even get around to covering on this podcast. When she's not working on Tommy's case, her full-time job involves reuniting people with long-lost family members, and you can find out more about this at her website, reunitepeople.com. Whatever happens, I know that Tommy Zeigler's supporters will never stop fighting for him until the day he dies. So if anyone out there has any information which can help Tommy's case, please get in touch with Lynn Marie Carty through one of her websites. But if you just have your own theory about what happened, if you can somehow concoct your own airtight theory about this case which makes complete sense, I'd really love to hear from you. If you have some interesting information about this case which wasn't covered here on this episode, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email. If you'd like to get in touch, you can email me at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Also, be sure to check out The Trail Went Cold on Facebook and Twitter. We're now available for download on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Music, so be sure to leave us a rating or a review at any of those places, because that will help us garner more exposure. And like I mentioned earlier, we also have a donate button on our website, so if you're feeling generous and want to express your appreciation for all the hard work we put into this podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. I want to thank all my loyal listeners and supporters out there, especially those from the aforementioned Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide the obligatory shout-out to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and is the managing editor of The Back Row, the website which hosts this very podcast. I gave McGill a monster episode to assemble this time around, but per usual, he came through in a big way. And of course, a big shout out to Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. You can also check out my true crime and mystery articles at crack.com and listverse.com, and there's plenty of other non-true crime content you can find right here at The Back Row. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for a new mini-sode of The Trail Went Cold. I think I will close things with this soundbite from the documentary A Question of Innocence, featuring a quote from the man himself, Tommy Zeigler.
As long as there's breath in my body, I'm going to have hope. And I do believe that sooner or later, somebody with some intelligence and fairness is going to stop and say, oh no, enough is enough. That's what I believe.